All right.
Okay,
So,
well, yeah, go ahead. We're
you
going to
go
now
ahead.
go into part two here of our debate, and Daryl is going to now lead off the cross-examination section of the debate. Go ahead, Daryl.
Okay. All right. So, I remember early on as a Christian, I was so convicted by my driving that I wouldn't put a fish emblem on the back of my car just because I knew I needed to do some work in my aggressive driving style. So let me ask you a question. If you were to come across somebody that had a bumper sticker on the back of their car that said Jesus is Lord, and they were very rude to you on the highway, cut you off, stuck their hand out the window and flipped you off, God forbid, would you say that that would be an accurate way to judge Christianity?
It would cause me to question the faith of that particular person. I might say, yeah, that guy thinks he's following Jesus, but I'm not sure that he really is.
Okay. I think that was exactly the point that I was making with Islam. I mean, they people adhere to different religions differently, and nowhere does Christianity teach behavior like that. But you will find that Islam does teach violence. I want to go back to another thing that you mentioned. You talked a lot about some of your peaceful Muslim friends in response to my comment on the Islamic schools of jurisprudence. Now, I don't think that's quite fair to reference what your friends or what specific Muslims are doing in comparison to what a school of jurisprudence has already settled. So once again, I want to ask you, can you name one school of Islamic thought, Shiite or Sunni? It doesn't matter. Can you name one that condones peaceful coexistence between Muslims and non-Muslims?
And that's a great question, Daryl. And honestly, I would have to just appeal to my own ignorance in this regard. I mean, I do believe I can, with some confidence and with some certainty, point again to individual Muslims, even within the Middle East, who are very open and willing to sit down with Christians and discuss with them what they have in common and share their common ground. And as you and I have both alluded to, we haven't gone into the specifics yet. There is a lot of common ground between Islam and Christianity. I would say more so than we have between Judaism and Christianity, to be honest. But when you ask me, are there specific schools, well, that I know of, no. Maybe there are, but if there are, I'm not aware of them. But I am aware of many testimonies that I've heard from Christians who have traveled to the Middle East and who have sat down with imams and have had conversations between Muslims and Christians, whether those were, like a conference or an event that was held either in a neutral place or in a church or sometimes even in a mosque. So I do see that there is an openness among individual or groups of Muslims who are open to this. If you're asking me if there are, sort of schools of thought or entire systems of Islam that are open to it, well, probably not.
Okay. Um, you and I have, I think we talked a little bit before the debate, and I heard you just now mentioned common ground, and I think you and I would agree that there is a lot of common ground between Christianity and Islam, and those are certainly great opportunities to build a bridge to the gospel from, and we should look for opportunities like that. I would rather be sharing the gospel with a Muslim than debating you about violence in the religion.
Right.
But um, let's say you had a counterfeit $100 bill and somebody gives it to you. How do you tell the difference between a genuine $100 bill and a counterfeit? Do you look at common characteristics, or do you look at differences?
Yeah, and I'm aware of that as an analogy, and of course I understand where you're going with this, and of course you don't determine what the true thing is um, by studying the counterfeit. You don't determine what a counterfeit is by studying other counterfeits. But I would say, to respond to that though, I think it's better to learn about Islam from a Muslim. In other words, another human being who is a Muslim, who was born into it, was raised in it, and someone who is living it, maybe even generationally, has been a Muslim, and to sit down with an actual person who is a Muslim, and I've done this many times, and spend time listening to them tell you about their faith and about what is meaningful to them about their faith and how their faith enriches their life and provides meaning to their culture and their family and things like that. I think if you've done that, Daryl, that you've seen the truth. You've seen what Islam truly is. And I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that if all you've done is pick out verses in their book that seem violent, I'm not sure that you're really seeing
Well, that's
what is
not what
true.
I've done. I've interacted with many Muslims, and I have a couple of Muslims' names in my phone right now, and I speak to them as frequently as I possibly can. But let me ask you this. This is this is my time to ask questions. So let me ask you: if you have a peaceful, loving Muslim friend, how would you know? I mean, how would you know if that Muslim was being deceptive to you? How would you know that?
Well, the same way I know that you're not being deceptive to me right now. How would I know that about anybody at any point or any time? Right. Well, I take it
Okay.
on faith. I think I'm a judge of character.
Right.
It's not like I haven't been tricked or lied to in the past. I'm 52 years old. I've lived a pretty good life, and I've been taken for a ride a couple of times, and people have
Yeah.
lied to me and tricked me and things like that. So Muslims, and actually, truthfully, so far none of them were Muslims. Most of them were either Christians or otherwise. But no, I wouldn't know that necessarily. But I have no reason to think that they would lie to me about this. There's nothing for them to gain to misrepresent their faith to me.
You don't think you have a reason to believe that, seeing that their scriptures and their perfect example, Muhammad, condoned deception? You don't see that as a reason to 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 believe that they could possibly be smiling in your face and cursing you within their heart, as Muhammad said?
Well, you know what? Honestly, Daryl, I just don't approach anybody that way. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah, I don't either, to
I
be
try to
honest
give
with you.
everybody the benefit of the doubt. You know what I mean? I want to believe the best about
Yeah,
everybody,
yeah,
and so I couldn't convince myself that that's the way I should approach anybody, whether they're a Muslim or whatever.
no, and again,
I
I'm not. I'm sorry, Keith. Go ahead.
no, I was done. Go ahead.
My time, my time's running out.
Go. You know
And
what?
again, I'm not.
Just go for it.
Yeah, I'm not condoning that. That's not my approach with Muslims usually either. I'm simply trying to make a point with you, and that is the fact that Islam condones this type of thing. It condones deception, and it condones violence, and this is clearly taught in their scriptures. So you have no way of knowing if you're being deceived or not. Now, that does not mean that we treat them any differently, and that does not mean that we don't love on them like Jesus. But I don't guess you have a Bible close by, do you?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Would you read 2 Corinthians 10:5 for me? You, It
Okay.
talks a
Yep.
lot about taking, examining the plank in our own eye before we look at religions, other religions. And I would respond to that by saying that I'm held accountable by my local church, my local pastor, friends, and family. and that's where my accountability is at. That's not to say that I don't have a log in my own eye, but that has nothing to do with whether or not Islam is a religion of violence or not.
Yeah.
2 Corinthians 10:5 pretty much commands us to do what
I've got it.
I'm
I've got it.
Okay.
It says, actually, starting in, I'd say in verse 3, for though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. And we will be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete.
Okay. Thank you, Keith. I think I went over a little bit, so you feel free to take a few minutes extra.
Yeah. Oh, that's okay. And I think this second part, we don't have to worry so much about our time, as long as we're just talking about this topic together. And see, to me, I'm glad you brought up that 2 Corinthians 10:5 verse, because to me, I think that again, the way I look at 2 Corinthians 10, I feel like what Paul is saying is he's speaking more to Christians about their own thoughts, right? About taking every captive thought and making it obedient to Christ for yourself. In fact, usually this is the way I've always heard that passage applied, is that I'm to consider every thought that comes into my mind and hold that thought captive to Christ, not to allow thoughts to enter my own mind. So it's I don't think it's necessarily a verse about the way we would struggle against people who have different beliefs than, in other words, people of other faiths. And I understand you're applying that in a different way. But I think, again, it brings up a good point that, how do we fight like Christians, right? So Christians, our enemy, according to 1 Peter 5:8, our enemy is not any human being.
That's right.
Our enemy is Satan, right? And so our struggle, Ephesians 6, is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers and authorities and powers and things like that in the heavenly realms. So for me, I don't feel that I'm called to fight against other people because they have different views and things like that. And I'm not asking you a question. I guess I'm supposed to be asking you a question. So let me switch over to that. Maybe I'll talk about that when I get to the closing statement. So you mentioned. Well, let's go back to something else. Something that you had said that you said you felt like Christians don't have a problem. You said flying planes into buildings or blowing people up or driving cars into crowds. But I gave you a list of very specific people who were Christians, who at least said they were Christians, and who were doing these violent things. Wouldn't you say that, at least in those cases, sometimes some Christians do have a problem with acting violently?
Well, certainly in some cases, but again, I responded to that by saying you don't judge a religion by how somebody misunderstands it. Jesus nowhere condones that kind of thing. That's not the case with Islam. That's the difference.
Right. And so let me ask a follow-up question to that. So you talked about the fact that you, like me, have had conversations with people who are Muslims, and as you said, you got phone numbers in your phone. You call and talk to people that are Muslims. I mean, when you talk to them, do you come across with the feeling, or do you see evidence in their life that there is in their life a fruit of violence? Because Jesus tells us that we should judge people by their fruit. And again, the people that I know that are Muslim, if I look at the fruit of their life, I don't see people who are living in a violent way. So do you not see that as well with people that are Muslim, or do you observe people who are Muslims being especially violent?
Absolutely. I feel like this is the same question again that you just asked. And, these people that I have in my phone, I even had, recently, he's no longer a coworker, but I had a gentleman from Syria. He just got his citizenship in the United States. I certainly didn't go up to him, asking him about violence in the Quran. I loved on him like Jesus, and I offered to take him out to eat. And I was looking for servant evangelism opportunities. But that's a completely different topic. That says nothing about whether Islam is violent or peaceful. We can't judge how the behavior of a Muslim and determine how Islam is, inherently violent or inherently peaceful. Hopefully, Muslims and Christians will represent their belief systems well, but that's not always the case.
So do you, because I also mentioned how looking at the text of the Old Testament scriptures, the New Testament, and the Quran comparatively, that there's twice as many verses in the Old Covenant scriptures that speak about violence, and pretty bloody, shocking violence. Commands to kill women and children and animals and things like this, and half as many verses in the Quran that have similar commands. So on one level, what do I want to ask here? So, well, first of all, I guess I would ask, from the outside looking in, okay, let's say you and I are not Christians. We just have we're looking at three different religions here. Religion A has a book that has twice as many violent verses in it than the one in the middle, and then the one in the middle has even more than the one on the other end. So A, B, and C. So C has the least of all violent scriptures. Is it fair then to say that the most violent of those religions is C, when it has much less violent scriptures referenced than the other two?
Well, again, even if the Bible did condone violence, that's not our debate. That's not our topic. But the Bible's clear that the Old Testament violence was for a specific group of people at a specific time and a specific place. That's not the case in the Quran and the Sunnah. The verses that I quoted and the hadiths that I quoted made it clear that this is something that should be ongoing until the day of resurrection. So you're not, even if you have a valid point there, you're not comparing apples to apples. And if we want to look at, if you're determined to look at what Muslims are doing, Keith, let me just give a shout out to Robert Spencer, who just come out with a new book, The History of Jihad, From ISIS to Muhammad. He has documented well over a 1,400-year history. And he says in this book that there is no ongoing length of time where Muslims and non-Muslims are coexisting peacefully. And there's no place, no time, nowhere where they are living together where Muslims are not subjugating Christians and Jews. And we have a 1,400-year history of that. So I'm just not convinced, with all due respect to you, I'm just not convinced by what you're saying.
So but I could write a book, and books have been written. I could very easily write a book that started at the time of Constantine and said within 40 years of Constantine taking power, Christians took up the sword and killed other Christians, and that was an unbroken line of violence against the church, where basically Christians went from being persecuted by the Roman Empire prior to Constantine to Christians continue to be killed after Constantine in much greater numbers, this time, however, by other Christians. So Christians have, 1,500 years of violence, history of violence as well against other Christians and non-Christians as well, but also even just have killed other believers that killed their brothers and sisters in Christ. And that begins with from the Donatists during the time of Constantine, as I said, the Inquisition, the Crusades, the burning martyrs, heretics at the stake, and people like Calvin and Luther presiding over people being martyred and tortured and killed for their faith, and the Anabaptists. So I think you could say the same thing about Christianity. And again, I know that's not the topic of our debate, and if you want, I'll even concede to you that as far as the topic of the debate goes, you have won the debate. You have proven that Islam is a violent religion. But what I'm trying to say is that Christianity is just as violent, in some cases, perhaps even more violent. And that what we should be more concerned about is not which of us is more violent, but to say, what can we do about our own problem in this area? And then maybe you and I could talk about how we might help Muslims to overcome their struggle with violence. So that's my concern. I mean, but would you concede that for 1400 years, since the time of Constantine, that Christians have also had a problem with violence and killing other Christians and killing non-Christians?
Yeah, I'm certainly not going to deny that, we are all sinful people. But again, these people have misrepresented Christianity. I'm not denying that. I'm not denying that history's not full of people like that. But that's exactly what they've done. They've misrepresented the teachings of Jesus Christ. That's not the case with Islam. Muhammad was a very, very violent man. And Muslims, as much as they would like to get away from that, and I'm sure that there's some that do, they can't. What they need is to come to the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ. They need to hear the good news of Jesus Christ. And I'm certainly willing to take your point that people who have professed Christ and misrepresented him, that's a very serious matter. But they will answer to him someday. That's not to say that I shouldn't take it seriously and I shouldn't do whatever I can to expose that or point it out and hold people accountable if I possibly can. But ultimately, that's up to God Himself, and I take comfort in the fact that nobody gets away with anything. They're all going to stand before God someday, and every knee's going to bow, and every tongue's going to confess that Jesus Christ is Lord.
Yeah, amen, amen. Well, I agree with you on that. I'm probably over my time as well. I'm not sure where I was at, but I think that's probably my 10 minutes as well.
Well,
was there anything else, or do you want to move on to the closing statements?
We can move on to the closing statements, and I'll even go first if you want me to do that, and that way you can have the last word, if that's all right.
Whatever you like.
Okay,
that's great. Yeah, whatever you want.
Let me. Not that we have kept really close to our time, but we'll try to do that in our closing statements if you want.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes scheduled, but if you want to take 10, that's fine. Or if you want to go over a little bit, that's fine.
Okay. All right. Well, I feel like, you were making the same point over and over and over and over again. And that was never my argument. And, I think we pretty much settled that. The topic of our debate was, is Islam a religion of peace or violence? And I've heard nothing to change my position. You've brought up some very good points, some very serious matters that I take seriously. But again, I don't feel like they really have anything to do with whether or not Islam is violent or peaceful. So, I asked you to give me one school of thought, one Islamic school of jurisprudence that condones coexistence between Muslims and non-Muslims, and I didn't really feel like you were familiar with the different schools of thought. I'll be honest with you, I'm not as familiar as I would like to be, but there's not one within the Shiites, the Sunnis. It just doesn't exist. It's not there, and this is a settled matter, not according to me, but according to their own sources. I quoted the Reliance of the Traveler, which is an Islamic manual on Sharia law. The gates of ijtihad are closed. There is no such thing as reformation in Islam. What it is a settled matter according to these schools of thought. And the gates of ijtihad, that is the independent reasoning of individual Muslims. Your Muslim friends just don't have the right, according to the authorities in Islam, to say anything any differently than what's already settled. And these schools have already settled the fact that, in short, Islam is at war with the infidels, the kafirs. Kafir is a very derogatory term in reference to me and you. In fact, the Quran says for them not to take you and me as friends. I quoted Muhammad, a reference from Sahih Bukhari. It says that we smile in their faces, but we curse them in our hearts. So you can't really, this has been back and forth, I know, throughout the entire debate, but I have no choice but to bring it up again. Peaceful Muslims, the Muslim friends that you and I both have, they do not define Islam. It is as loving and as gentle and as peaceful as they may come across. Let me just say that I rejoice in the fact that most of them are peaceful. I believe that most of them are here and they are experiencing freedom like they've never experienced it in their home country. And I'm glad they're here because of that. I believe Christ perhaps brought them here because the church has not been faithful in going to all the nations. So this is an incredible opportunity to share the gospel. But Jesus said that we are to be wise as serpents as well. We need to have some wisdom in how we approach this. And that's not to say that we should look at every single Muslim and be skeptical about whether they're out to get us or not. That's not my approach either. I long for conversations with Muslims. I long to add 10 more names to my cell phone. It's something that I'm passionate about. I'm not looking to go out and label every Muslim that I encounter as out to get us Christians. That was never my point from the beginning. My point was that is what their religion teaches. And you can't deny that. We as followers of Christ, fighting this spiritual war that we are fighting, this battle of ideas, destroying arguments set up against the knowledge of God, need to be aware of that as we talk about who God is and who Jesus is. We are not being faithful to Him if we don't. So I just want to close with that positive statement, if I can, and that is the fact that, as I've already said, you and I have never had a face-to-face conversation. We've only talked over the internet, but I'm grateful that I met you, and I value you as a brother in Christ, and I value what you have to say. But we need to be aware of this topic that you and I are talking about. There is so much deception outside of Islam within the church itself, and truth is at the heart of God, I believe. So we need to be aware of that as we approach Muslims to share the gospel with them. And I went over about a minute, so I'm going to stop right there and turn it over to you, Keith.
All right, Daryl, thank you so much. This has been, I've enjoyed the conversation. I hope we have, I'd be happy to continue to have conversations with you on this topic anytime. So I want to end by just talking a little bit about what I mentioned, and it's come up throughout this debate, this idea of common ground. Many don't realize, in fact, I've noticed even many Muslims don't realize that Muhammad himself personally wrote a letter to his followers and commanded them to provide protection and favor to those who follow Christ. This was written in 626 AD, and it's called the Oath of Ashtename. You can look it up online. You can read it. The full text of it is online, and the actual scroll, which is written by Muhammad's own hand, still exists, and it's a holy relic for many people that follow Islam. And one of the things that it says, quoting from the Oath of Ashtenami written by Muhammad, says this: their churches, these are talking about Christians, their churches must be honored, and they must not be withheld from building churches or repairing convents. They must not be forced to carry arms, that's weapons, or stones. But the Islams must protect them and defend them against others. It is positively incumbent upon every one of the Islam nation not to contradict or disobey this oath until the day of resurrection and the end of the world. Now, that is a word from Muhammad himself. And as Daryl has pointed out, if you want to be a good Muslim, you have to put the teachings of Muhammad into practice. And so, again, what we have is a situation where there are many Muslims who selectively obey Muhammad because they want to be violent, and then they can justify violence in their scriptures, and therefore they commit violence. Christians have done the same thing for about 1,400 years, and that in itself doesn't make the religion violent. It tells you something about the person practicing the religion and what they would like to make their scriptures say, and what they would like to emphasize, and what they would like to ignore. But I would say that we have, if we want to, we have a beautiful place to start building bridges with people of the Muslim faith. We can begin with the ministry of reconciliation that Jesus gave to us to reach out to Muslims, building bridges, not walls against them. And I mentioned our house church family has hosted several Muslim people in our home, and it's been a beautiful thing. But I want to stress this. If you choose to look for the things that separate us, Christians and Muslims, I promise you, you will find it. But if you choose to look for what unites us, then you'll find that too. For example, I've noticed that Christians have no trouble overlooking all of the many differences they have with Jewish people, and instead to focus on all of the things they have in common with Jewish people. And I want to say, why can't we do the same thing with Muslims? Why can't we decide to say, you know what, I'm going to overlook the things that I disagree with Muslims the way I do with Jewish people, and I'm going to instead focus on the things that we have in common, which are amazing. Because again, if Christians can do this with Jewish people, the Jewish religion rejects Christ. They deny the deity of Christ. They call Jesus a bastard and a charlatan and a magician, and they think he was a fake. But we overlook that horrible offense to show love and mercy and compassion to Jewish people. We love Jewish people, right? Many Christians even host, seders in their church, and will sometimes even, have Israeli flags and things like this. And there's a whole movement of Christian Zionism, which I'm not a fan of, but of course I see still Christians who are so able, so capable of overlooking the things that they have, the differences they have, and looking at what they have in common. And I would encourage Christians to do the same with Muslims. Muslims believe many of the same things that we do. Now, not exactly. There are, of course, going to be some things that are different. But unfortunately, with every new terrorist attack, Christians in America struggle to respond as Jesus would. So like everyone else, we condemn terrorists. Like everyone else, we pray for the victims. Like everyone else, we cry out for retribution. And like everyone else, we paint every Muslim on earth as if they are someone evil who should be hated and feared and opposed. But we're not called to be like everyone else. We're called to be like Jesus. So I would say, instead of responding like everyone else does, we should take a step back and try to look at the problem the way Jesus does. Because when Jesus looks at them, he doesn't see a Muslim, or he doesn't see an American or European or an Asian, or what he sees are people made in his image that he would rather die than live without them. Speaking specifically of the things that we have in common, again, Muslims believe, and Islam teaches, that Jesus is the Word of God. Jesus is the Spirit of God. They believe that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus creates life, that Jesus cured a man born blind and a man with leprosy, that Jesus gives life to dead people, that Jesus ascended into heaven, that Jesus is still alive right now today, and he will come again to judge the entire world. So can you imagine? How could you possibly reject someone who believed all of those same things that you do about Jesus? What a beautiful place, a starting point, a beautiful common ground for us to begin with Muslims. But we have a choice. We can either keep making lists of all the ways that we're right and Muslims are wrong, or we can look for how much we have in common with them and have a conversation with them about Jesus. Many of them are very eager to sit and listen to you talk about what you know of Christ. If you are willing to sit and listen to them, talk of what they know of Christ, or of Isa, as they call him. Now, depending on the path we choose, one path will result in more division and violence, but the other path will result in an amazing conversation about Jesus with a Muslim and provide an opportunity for understanding and peace. And I want to ask, which are we most interested in? As long as we're only interested in seeking a path for opposition and division, well, then keep making lists of all the ways that we're right and they're wrong, or they're evil and we're holy, or they're violent and we're not. But if we're ready to start seeking a path for peace and reconciliation, which, by the way, Christ commanded us to do, then I say we should take full advantage of this amazing opportunity to talk with Muslims about Jesus, which is our common ground. And I would ask this: what would a religion of peace truly teach its followers to do? If we as Christians are a religion of peace, then I suggest we follow the path of peace. And that, I suggest, is to not make lists of things that say that we're right and they're wrong, or we're good and they're bad, or they're violent and we're not, but instead to look for the common ground, which is Christ, which is Jesus, and begin a dialogue there. If you really belong to a peaceful religion, then take the path of peace and engage in an open dialogue with a Muslim about what you have in common with them, which is Jesus. Thank you.
All right. Bless you, Keith.
So thank you, Daryl. Bless you, man. Appreciate so much you doing this with me. And again, I'm serious. I would love to talk to you anytime. It doesn't have to be a debate. Probably be better if it wasn't.
Anytime, my friend. Anytime.
All right.
I've never been to California before, but if I'm ever out that way, I would definitely let you know. But keep in touch, and please, certainly let me know when this is ready.
Absolutely, I sure will. I'll send you the file, and we can both share it.
All right, man. Have a great
evening.
Thank you so
much, Jerome.
God bless. Bye-bye.
You too. God bless.